Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second in this series of Stanton Lectures. You'll already understand the wisdom of having an IT specialist in the room to keep us on track, but I'm very glad to welcome you back today for the second in our series from Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad. Ram-Prasad is the Distinguished Professor of Comparative Religion and Philosophy at Lancaster University, and he is a Fellow of the British Academy. He's a leading international authority on the philosophy of Indian religious traditions, which he has studied intensively in comparative perspective. We're benefiting from the fruits of his research in this series of lectures as he explores approaches to the one and the many through a series of 3 comparisons and contrasts, each of them spanning 2 lectures. This evening, then, we're on the second half of the first comparison. This is entitled Overcoming Difference, World, Self, and What is Real, the contrasting responses of Śaṅkara and Zhuangzi. Tonight, we look forward to learning more about the latter. There will be an extended time for questions and discussion at the end, and if you're able, I hope that you'll remain for that. So without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Chakravarthi and invite you to welcome him as he delivers his second Stanton lecture.
Very much. So I left you with more or less these words from Śaṅkara, where he boiled down what his program is to this shift or switch in consciousness. Not a new form of consciousness, because consciousness always is the ultimate one, but some transition in consciousness, loosely called knowledge, whose key was the removal of difference. So what we saw was that Śaṅkara's metaphysical response to being confronted by the world of manyness and asking about himself, as with the old Upanishadic seers, what this I was in relation to the world in which it found itself, gave the answer that in fact that world of manyness, that world of diversity, that world which seemed to confront oneself, was not in fact ultimate, was in fact something generated through the very functions of awareness of it, beyond mere ontologies of realisms and idealisms. Ultimate principle was this consciousness, the one in which the self as well as all is contained. So we summed it up very broadly by saying that he dissolves the world that's different from the consciousness of it. He dissolves that world into consciousness. And the consciousness alone remains. Because we saw that there were all kinds of challenges, not only in Śaṅkara himself, but in the broader Advaita tradition, as to exactly how it happens. Today's comparison is going to be very different, and it's deliberately a juxtaposition with a thinker who, in many ways, is profoundly different, and also differently situated for me. Although I have read Zhuangzi over time and attempted to grapple with some of the classical Chinese with scholars now long retired, people like Roger Ames and Chad Hansen, who are major authorities of classical Chinese philosophy, I don't know him anywhere like, because I never grappled with him to the extent I have with Śaṅkara. But there's also another less contingent reason as to why approaching Zhuangzi is going to be a rather different project. There's not just my ignorance and my uncertainty. it is that the writings that come down to us attributed to him do not lend themselves to elucidation. In fact, Zhuangzi would suggest that if you tried to explain him, you're missing the point. So it's a very different approach to Śaṅkara, who, for all that in the end, wants there to be an experiential transition, nevertheless, as we were discussing yesterday, is an argumentative person. He's always trying to persuade you with the sequence of claims that he is making. And so to battle over what he means and how it's sustainable is something that he invites of the reader. Zhuangzi warns against that, and as we're going to see. What, in fact, over the years I've come to feel about his words is that it's best to kind of walk with him through the words as we receive it, and work very hard to try and find through a combination of translations and referring back to key classical Chinese terms, an English version which captures how I feel when I read him. And what we're actually going to see, therefore, is a kind of process by which you almost just need to contemplate yourself how you receive his word. I'll try and say a few things, but I might as well be standing here just doing that. Because from Zhuangzi's perspective, those are empty gestures that get in the way of your finding within yourself a certain settlement in relation to the world which he seeks. Nevertheless, the kind of things he says about a person, a human being, in relation to the world, broad structural questions, strikes me as having that same sense of estranged puzzlement with how we go about our ordinary ways. Just like with Śaṅkara, looking at the rituals and prayers and activities of normal life around him, says, is this really what we are about? Is this the way life is to be spent? Zhuangzi too looks at the elaborate ceremonies and rites and music, is usually taking aim at a broad kind of Confucian picture, although Confucius himself is a character often in his own work. He looks at that kind of world, the world which is as performatively normative for him as the Vedic rituals are for Śaṅkara's world. And he's estranged from the way in which people assume what they are and what the world is, this reality of difference. And he says there is something profoundly wrong here. It's that sense of estrangement from ordinary transactions of manyness that I found resonant between the two thinkers. And that's what I'm trying to sort of very tentatively pursue today. We're talking about Zhuangzi, who lived somewhere in the 4th century BCE. I'm not going to really weigh in on the scholarship of it, but there's this consensus broadly, and has been for the last 120 years, that the so-called 7 inner chapters, and then there are the outer and miscellaneous chapters of a collection of episodic, rather short passages, which are attributed to him. And the outer and the miscellaneous are thought not to be his, they're thought to be much more on the nose, much more, in a way, seeking to make clear what he leaves deliberately implicit. However, recent scholars have started referring to this other material in a continuous way, and I don't want to get drawn into it. So I try not to use that very much, except I think on occasions. I'm drawing on these 3 translations, and as I said, also referring back to many others, He's one of those people who magnetically attracts translations. And what you're going to read is a slightly different, slightly more ignorant version, as I tried to find the best choice of English words to go with some of the key terms of these anagrams. So let me begin in a structurally similar way to Śaṅkara, which is that what is this that Zhuangzi is talking about, which he thinks people don't ordinarily get? And that's always his concern. There is a way of going about this world in which you miss what there is. What there is, of course, famously what's called Tao. This particular anagram normally translated as the way. Says the way has its nature and its trustworthy signs, but it is without action and form. You can hand it down, but you cannot receive it. You can get it, but you cannot see it. It is its own trunk, its own root. Before heaven and earth existed, it was there, firm from ancient times. It gave spirituality, spirit to the spirits and gods. It gave birth to heaven and earth. It exists beyond the highest point and yet cannot be called lofty. It exists beneath the limits of the six directions and yet cannot be called deep. It was born before heaven and earth and yet cannot be said to have been there for long. It is earlier than the earliest times and yet it cannot be called old. So these are the kind of antinomian terms that, of course, echo in many other traditions. And one possible way of reading it is to make a straight comparison with Brahman. And in fact, I think there's a collection of papers called Brahman and Tao, where people have tried to see whether there's a metaphysical functionality to the concept of Brahman and Tao, which are similar. I'm not going to do that. I'm not making a comparison about the content of these two concepts. Rather, what I'm trying to get at is simply in Zhuangzi's setting up terms. What is this Tao? And it is antinomian. But it is, and I hope that the next couple of passages will maybe clarify why he's talking in this way. What I take away from this passage is not necessarily the function, the metaphysical outline, a program. It could be. That's not what I take away from it. What I take away from this is this, the importance of what looks apparently paradoxical, is certainly antinomian in the way it is put. What Zhuangzi is trying to do is to have you go back and forth between things which should hold together but don't. You think you need to be able to see this to get it. No, but you can get the Tao, but you won't see it. It is beyond, and yet it is older than the oldest, and yet it cannot be called new. It cannot be called old, it's new. It exists beneath the limits of the six directions, and yet it cannot be called deep. So what do you mean? So again, we are led to think that, as with so many other traditions, some kind of a negativa is being sort of brought out here. A way of leading people through saying, you can say a few things, but as soon as you say those things, what you associate with them don't follow. So there is an inescapability to the conceptual use of language when you're trying to reach the limits of your thought. But every step of the way, you need to undermine yourself as you go along. Otherwise, you're going to have mere contradiction. And these are not contradictory statements. They're not saying simply flat, there is this and it is not this. Rather, it is that you deploy things that take you to the limits of what you could think of as beyond this world, as what is ultimate, as what is real. And even as you utter it, you think, oh, there must be a cluster of concepts with it. No, not that. So it is not so much the description of the Tao that we need to think about as this method of progression that Zhuangzi opens up. This carries on, I think, something similar, but I think perhaps takes us a bit further. Where you assert it is a little stalk or a great pillar, a leper or the beautiful shield. Things ribald, diverse or strange. The way lets them be one. This I found something that's worth really wrestling with. Their dividedness, manyness, is their completeness. Their completeness breaks them. I'll stop at that point before we get on. The way I kind of try to read it, elucidating Zhuangzi as I shouldn't, it seems like what he's trying to say is that manyness is constitutive of the one. But as soon as you say there is one, then you break it apart. The completeness breaks them. So once you say, I have now assembled all the ontological fact, and this is the one which contains them, it breaks apart. Whereas simply encountering this infinitude of manyness is what the way is. So there is this, the dialectic between the one and the many here is kind of held here in deliberate irresolution. Nothing is complete or broken, but all are free, freely let to be one again. One has to be far-reaching in vision to let things freely be one. Then he, man, the genuine person, has no use for asserting things. It rests in the usual at hand. The usual at hand can be used. What is used can pass freely. When it passes freely, you align with it. And with alignment, you're almost there. Just rely on that. Doing that without knowing how things are is what I call the way. Other places, he's going to put pressure on whether this is action versus knowledge. There are places where he's going to say more positive things about knowledge and less positive. But you see the broad contours of the Taoism that he's talking about here, the way that he's talking about. What is the relationship? And this is where I think it would be so perilous to try and compare the way as it occurs here with the Brahman in Śaṅkara or in the Upanishads. And the key for it really rests in this second part. This a genuine person, a person who is walking along the way, has no use for asserting things, but rests in the usual at hand, the things that are already there. The usual at hand can be used. What is used can pass freely, and when it passes freely, you align with it. You have to do things which are completely normal. So this is, in a way, particularly difficult thing when you're going to have him, and we're going to have other passages in which he's having characters criticize rights and music, criticizes, boasts about people who say, I've stopped doing those things, I'm not enamored of them. And yet here, he is asking you to carry on with your actions. So in a sense, it's a call against the kind of contemplative discipline that seemed to be the be-all and end-all for Śaṅkara. What he's saying is almost just do not assert things, although of course he is asserting it. But don't assert them. have no use for asserting them. So in a way, of course, I'm telling you, I'm asserting these things just to tell you it's no use asserting them. So in a way, my performative contradiction is itself a means of guidance to you. What you need to do is just the usual at hand. You are playing a lute of a warm afternoon, and the music just holds the villagers while they go about their daily tasks. And they don't even notice it because they're so used to your sitting there in the afternoon doing that, then fetching the corn or whatever else you should be doing. It's at hand. The world of the villagers is filled with your activity and your presence, but you're not doing it to say, I am one with all these people, I am at peace with the world, I'm no longer bound with the anxieties of threshing the corn for the winter. You don't assert anything about the way the world is. You don't even say, none of this matters, people, there's a greater reality. You do nothing. You sit there and you play the lute. It's just at hand. And anybody can come and sit with you and learn, or anybody can carry on working while the music wafts in the air. Being that way is in the way. That's what the way is. Doing without knowing is what I call the way. So, of course, he is in a different position because Zhuangzi is not the lute player. He is commenting on it and is, in his teaching, estranged in exactly the way he is anxious about the world. Whereas that lute player, the one, the you, who's doing things without knowing things, is following the way because he's just with the thing at hand. So there is a real decisive point, however many times he qualifies and walks back from it and undermines it in Zhuangzi, which is this, there is something to do with living and acting. This is not about an epistemic method. How exactly is it acting? What is it to say, well, the usual is at hand, it can be passed freely? Well, some things count, some things don't. The example I gave of the lute, playing the lute, is one thing. But yet at the same time, to construe this as music in terms of culture, in terms of ritual, in terms of the necessary rites, which is so much at the heart of Confucian tradition. That is not being at one with the way. Whereas somebody who just happens to play the lute, pick it up and play it as he's done all these summer months, all these years, that person is going along the way. So Zhuangzi does absolutely without, almost provocatively without consistency, talks about certain actions as problematic in a way that, as we will see, look very much like what Śaṅkara would have said. Don't be bound by these rituals. It's just the wrong place to be. And yet, there is this very clear difference that whatever it is that is the way and the way to be, it has something to do with a set of ordinary actions, an attitude to those actions and the actions themselves. So at this point, it starts looking like, well, I can understand a bunch of villagers being beguiled by the music. They've stopped cursing this man for not contributing his role, doing his duty to prepare for the winter. They wonder when he found the time to learn to play the lute. They don't do all of that. Fine. So they're flowing through this village life with the music in the air, and the man is playing it with no further thought. Okay, that's a vignette which kind of captures a certain kind of non-striving. But could we then try and define it? Master Eastwall, in another place, and this is one of the later passages, it's a little bit more specific, a little bit more ready to talk about what looks like an underlying metaphysics, I'm not sure, but it comes as a good attempt at what happens when we go beyond that vignette and start talking about, well, is that the way? Master Eastwall asked Zhuangzi, where is this so-called way? Where does it exist? Zhuangzi said, there's nowhere it isn't. Come, you must be more specific. He replied, sir, your questions simply don't reach the substance. When the inspector of the hunt asked the superintendent of the market about poking a pig with a foot to test its fatness, he was told, the lower, the better. The nearer you come to the truth of how fat the pig is. But you shouldn't insist. There is nowhere it isn't fat. A fat pig is a fat pig. The perfect way is like that. And so too are the great words. Complete, everywhere, all inclusive, one, whatever. These are different words with the same meaning, all make the same point. And this is where, so scholars say, that kind of last couple of sentences go beyond what you normally find in the inner chapter. Don't sort of just say, do you understand the point about a pig? Yes, of course you should poke it near its back, where you would know best whether it's fat or not. But if it's fat everywhere. And stop. You to make up. What do you want to do with it? Whereas in these kind of outer chapters and the supplementary chapters, whoever is writing this is kind of is painfully aware that there is deeper meaning here and tries to spell it out. And I'm in two minds myself. Do you want to be told complete and everywhere and all-inclusive are different words with the same meaning? They all make the same point. Well, what is that point? Does, in other words, enunciating an underlying metaphysics of oneness get us further than what simply absorbing the story tells us? I'm not sure. But what I would say is that in the examples I have been giving, this way that he's pointing to is a way that can only be approached in an antinomian way. You have to talk about it in ways that collapse our expectations about how concepts work. Each concept carries with it certain kinds of implications, and as soon as you cling to those implications, you don't get to the way. So you have to say a few things while also rejecting the things that come with those ways of talking. It's only in that very painful, self-undermining way that one can walk along the Tao. And walking along the Tao is, as walking implies, as a path implies, a set of actions. But those actions cannot be regimented. They cannot be thought through. They simply have to be a certain, that's why we talk about things like flow and so forth when we talk about Taoism. It's a way of continuing to live which does not seek, but stays with what is at hand. So Johnson is really struggling in a way to kind of articulate how you respond to this problem. The problem that the world is many and there are all these kinds of things, and we find ourselves in relation to all these things, and we're always trying to understand them in some one big way. All of those things he can see, and he's fed up of that. But what he suggests in return is not a clear, straightforward argument for how to be, because for him, that is self-undermining. Rather, he talks about this attitudinal adjustment in ordinary activity. So if that is that plenitude, the way that is elusive as soon as you try and clarify its nature, but yet is at hand in the most ordinary activity of yours, who are you in relation to that? Zhuangzi, Confucius, as a Taoist teacher in Chuangzi, says, we go around telling one another, I do this, I do that, but how do we know what we mean by this I? You dream you're a bird and soar up into the sky, you dream you're a fish and dive into the pool. But now as you're telling me about it, there's no telling if you who speak are awake or dreaming. Be content to go along and forget about change. And then you can enter the oneness of heaven, the sky. Yeah. Again, the reason I leave the alternative, rigorous translation of the vacant sky is because we want heaven here to, again, indicate a particular kind of place to be reached. Now, this kind of questioning about the I, this constant pointing out that we don't know whether we're dreaming or not, and we're going to keep coming back to it in the next 2 or 3 slides, are very characteristic of Zhuangzi and quite different from how questions about I-ness and questions about dreaming enter China about 500 years later with Buddhism. So we've got to see this in its own terms. So the puzzle that he is having is the minute you take up an attitude of questioning, of inquiry, as soon as you ask what Shankara thought the most obvious thing to do, which is, who am I in relation to this world? As soon as you ask that question, you're actually setting yourself up to fail. So the epistemological project, which seemed at the heart of the discipline in the face of manyness that Shankara talks about, is the greatest problem for Johnson. Just be content to go along and forget about, are you dreaming? Are you awake? And that's very interesting. You could have a whole other thought just on the use of dreaming in Shankara and in the amongst the Buddhists, and the huge debates about, do we know whether we are dreaming or not, which happened between about the 4th and the 10th century in classical Indian thought. There, the arguments are much more comparable to what we might be familiar with in some ways after Descartes in early modern Western philosophy. About epistemological problems, about how do we know whether you're dreaming or asleep? What would it be like if we are in a constant state of dream? Is it a sustainable idea to think you could have a notion of dreaming which is not parasitic on waking? These are the kinds of moves that go back and forth between various classical Indian schools. In Zhuangzi, you're not, that notion of you don't know whether you're dreaming or you're awake, or if you're dreaming, what you're dreaming, is not deployed in that way. What it is it's a consideration that therapeutizes you exactly against the kind of things that so obsessed the classical Indians, the early modern Europeans. Zhuangzi draws from our puzzlement about whether we could be dreaming or awake the exact opposite lesson, which is it is not about how much turns on whether you can establish whether you're awake or asleep, whether there's a greater reality you can get to or not. What it points to is, this is human experience. There really is no telling. You can come up with all these theories, but those theories are again going to structure you in relation to the world in a way that makes you forget the Tao. So if you forget about asking, have I changed into a state of wakefulness? Am I still dreaming? Then you're contented. And in contentment, like my lute player, you're just reaching to thing in hand. You wake up, you're asleep. You're asleep, you wake up. You dream, you dream, you wake up and you talk about your dreams. You let it flow, you don't cling to any of them. This way of rereading from a modern philosophical point of view, the lesson of dreaming and waking is one I think that has not been fully assimilated in contemporary debates and discussions. Because as I said, both with classical Indian and early modern Western thought, in fact, of course, going back to Plato in terms of the notion of dreams and so forth, the metaphysical consequences of being able to establish whether you're dreaming or waking is absolutely vital to unlocking the understanding of reality that one might have. In Zhuangzi, it's just beside the point. So this is brought out, of course, in the most famous example, which is about a dream. Once Zhuangzi, he called himself, dreamed he was a butterfly, a happy butterfly, flitting and fluttering around, showing off and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he woke up, solid, yet surprised Zhuangzi, who did not know who was the butterfly in Zhuangzi's dream. Zhuangzi in the butterfly's dream. Between Zhuangzi and the butterfly, there must definitely be a difference. At this point, you're thinking, yeah, there must be a difference. He's not saying, therefore, let's find the difference. Rather, he is mocking the idea, the reflex, to say, oh, we must find the difference between me and the butterfly. This is called the equalizing of things. The equalizing of things is not trying to say, we must find out now what the difference is between my dreaming that I'm a butterfly and the butterfly dreaming me. The things that surely seem that must carry a difference between them. The equalizing of things is the matterlessness of whether you are the butterfly's dream or you are dreaming the butterfly. Because it is defining the difference. It is embarking on that project of making the difference between what a butterfly is and what I am, what waking is and what dreaming is, what butterfly's dream is and what my dream is. These are all the features of difference. This world in which they're constantly being generated. And as Enoch already pointed out to you, that actually these don't constitute a oneness, they just must be left to themselves. The equalizing of things, the term used for Qi Wu, that it doesn't get us very far in trying to develop an epistemological program. What it does is a kind of breathe out, let go. Stop clinging to the ways of thinking that try and pin differences. Not denying differences, I've already told you that. Not denying differences. Many things are there. But don't try and unify them by determining the individual components, the different things that make up the one. So that you can say, this is real, this is not real. Of the things that are real, these are the components. That entire program is fundamentally misguided. That is what Zhuangzi finds frustrating in human beings. This reflex to try and step out of what is at hand. Try and say, instead of saying, I had a funny dream. I dreamt that I was a butterfly's dream. That's the end of that story. Not, so what was it in my conceptual construction that made me have that dream in such a way that I can now be sure that I am not dreaming still, that I dreamt that I was the butterfly's dream? Those kinds of questions take you down into a wrong way of being in relation to the way. And it's so very hard, so very elusive, and I try and sort of work my way through Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is sort of stopping at the most unexpected places. What's he trying to do? I can't explain to myself, so less can I explain to you. Rash task, therefore, in having undertaken to give a lecture on this topic. But I hope that what we are finding is actually, without any single conceptual breakthrough, you start getting a sense of this. There is a method. It's trying to make us think in a particular way through these words. And it is about just letting be. This, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the relationship between the one and the many, as we already saw, and the relationship between dreaming and waking, and the epistemic reflex to try and sort them out. And this idea that we could try and sort it out, for Zhuangzi, is the fundamental error that we commit. So if for Śaṅkara, the fundamental error was to have this mutual superimposition of what is not with what is, and to generate conceptions of I-ness and mine-ness, and thereby undertake actions which are therefore fundamentally beside the point in the face of Brahman. For Zhuangzi, the misunderstanding which afflicts all of us is being caught in this generativity of manyness. He who dreams of drinking wine may weep when morning comes. He who dreams of weeping, may the morning go off to hunt. While he is dreaming, he does not know it is a dream, and in his dream, he may even try to interpret a dream. Only after he wakes up does he know it was a dream. So the point here is he's not really worried about whether we can make a distinction between dreams and waking. Of course we can. That's not the point. The point is, what energy are you putting into it, and with what purpose? Only after he wakes up does he know it was a dream. And someday there will be an even greater awakening when we know that being awake is a great dream. Yet the stupid believe that they are awake, so busily and brightly unquestioning, that they know it, calling this man a ruler, this one a herdsman. Incorrigible. It is the unquestioning claim to knowledge. So just as Śaṅkara was saying, that fundamental miscognition is claiming that you know who you are, what the world is, what is your relationship to the world. Zhuangzi, in a sense, says that's what the fundamental misunderstanding is, that you do not question. You think that the world and its differences and you in relation to it and the different states through which you go are all self-evident. It is the assertion of a life lived in manyness that he worries about. And that's where I find a resonance with Śaṅkara. He's sort of almost annoyed with people just as is incorrigible of you. You just take the world as it's given and you accept it. That's the problem. So what happens when a person starts really behaving in that way, that his actions are only to hand, to what is at hand? He does not claim knowledge, he does not seek it, nor does he simply wallow in what he does not know. Because Zhuangzi is equally critical here, as we have seen. He's as critical of the person claiming knowledge of things and seeking to unify them and so forth, as is against someone who just assumes that he knows the world is many and lives in it. So what happens to somebody who's negotiated the way through? Henry said, I am improving. I have forgotten benevolence, great Confucian virtue, and righteous conduct. I have forgotten rights and music. I cast off my limbs and trunk, drive out perception and intellect, leave my body, abandon knowledge, and identify with the great thoroughfare of comprehension. So that is what happens. This is a person who is on the right path. And this is a person who is stripping away all the kinds of activities that can only proceed either through thinking you know or not even asking whether you know. You don't want either of that. And here again, arriving, from a completely different place, you find Zhuangzi's identification of what such a person would be so similar to what Śaṅkara is talking about. What is the person to be? The person who has forsaken his rites and rituals and his duties. The person who has given up Vedic rituals is the one who, in this context, has even forgotten rites and music. It's not just refusing to do them, just forgotten because he no longer is structured in his relationship to the world through these many aspects of what constitutes his world. So I'm absolutely struck by how at one moment it looks like you cannot find two more different thinkers than Zhuangzi and Śaṅkara. And then there are other places where you're stunned by how part of it is that diagnosis, but also part of it is their attention towards who is the person who has got to this point of overcoming the obduracy of manyness. And the description looks startlingly similar. So what is that person who is forgotten all of these kinds of rituals and demands? His liking was one, and his not liking was one. His being one was one, and his not being one was one. In being one, he was acting as a companion of heaven. In not being one, he was acting as a companion of humanity. When humanity and heaven do not defeat each other, that is called a genuine person. Genuine is the choice of words I've gone here with the much debated concept. So this is where, again, you find the emphasis on things to hand, the attitude of simply living through what is most easily there, but with a different attitude, really comes in. This detachment is not, as with Śaṅkara, this scrubbing away of conceptuality and exhausting the identification of oneself with aspects of the world. It's not, in that sense, this very daunting cognitive enterprise. Rather, it is simply a way of appropriateness. So, at one and the same time, so a duke might say that, I need to be a good swordsman to protect my people and put a lot of effort into it. But he might also be able to reflect on this focus on his stature and his responsibilities and his activities out on the battlefield as misleading him. So how can the Duke do both things? Well, the one who has found a genuine way through does. There are ways of behaving in which this kind of the manyness of the world is not salient to a genuine person. There are also other places where the Duke won't turn around and say, shoo, shoo, go away, I'm not going to protect you against the marauding, neighboring army because I'm sitting here contemplating. Because that would also be, in a way, to write in a particular view of himself into this world. So he is at one, when he is a companion of heaven, in not being one, in being part of the many, he's acting as a companion of humanity. So there is an aptness and an appropriateness in his flow. I'm going to end with perhaps the most famous, apart from the butterfly, famous example from Zhuangzi, which is the case of cooked bean. So this local Duke, Lord Wenhui, comes in, hears about his extraordinary skill. He finds him cutting the carcass of a buffalo, and he's struck by it, he's stunned by it. It's, how do you do it? And Cook Ding says, what your servant cares about is the way, which goes beyond technique. When I first began cutting up oxen, all I could see was the ox itself. After 3 years, I no longer saw the whole ox. And now I go at it by spirit. I don't look with my eyes. Perception and sensible knowledge have come to a stop, and spirit moves where it wants. I go along with the natural patterns, strike in the big hollows, guide the knife through the big openings, and follow things as they are. So I never touch the smallest ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. The point is, the cook or the butcher is still doing his work. He has not cut himself off. He's got a job, he's employed, he makes money out of what he does. He is in that world. So in that sense, he is not one, because he's a companion of humanity. He's going to have to cut, he's going to have to sell them in different ways, he's going to talk to the Duke who's heard about his skill, all of that. And yet also, of course, he is at one as a companion of heaven, which is that the way he acts is simply flowing through how the way is. Nothing has been revealed about the structure of the way. Nothing has been seen, because it cannot be seen. Something has been received. The Duke has received from Cook Ding the way to be a genuine person. So to some extent, you kind of glimpse this forever lost world in which it's only when seeing the cook, when seeing Johnson himself, that perhaps what it was to live through manyness towards the way was evident. And as soon as it's put in these words, as soon as it's commented on, as soon as it is filtered through translations and centuries of commentary and our own cultural compulsions, you feel a certain loss to it. So the loss here is a different kind of loss to what might be felt when you're trying to wrestle with the philosophical problem that Śaṅkara sets up about how consciousness, which is always one, gets back to being one when there is nowhere for it to go. There is a conceptual puzzle, but there is also a particular kind of practice. As we were talking yesterday, we really put severe pressure here on the difference between knowledge and action and so forth. Yeah, but there is a particular transformation which is radically different from what Zhuangzi is saying, because what he says about the way is very different from what Śaṅkara thinks is Brahman. But yet, I think they share in common what I call a formal structure of resistance to plurality, about what to make of the chaos of adhering to the simple reality of plural things, including rituals and morals. They see a world around them of manyness. And that's not right. Why is it not right? They give two such amazingly, radically opposed answers. Śaṅkara responds by developing a metaphysics that explains the world as not different from itself. Zhuangzi seems to respond by finding ways of having the subject, or the genuine person, becoming immersed in the world. So I suppose my sort of simplest way of putting it, and it is misleading, is to say Śaṅkara wants the world to be dissolved into himself. The I, that is consciousness, that is Brahman, is one. Zhuangzi seeks to be dissolved into this world, the world which is one of the many at the same time. And because of where they start from, the structure within which they work, with ideas that pre-existed them, Brahman and Tao, how they see that structure, what they think is the consequence of it, and what the response should be, are very different. But in holding this comparison between them, contrast between them together, I hope we start seeing why it's really dangerous in a way when talking about oneness to find one explanation of oneness. What is really gripping is that there could be oneness is seen in so many ways.